The air in the land agent's office was stale with the scent of old paper and finality. It was a cold room for a cold day, the sort of biting November afternoon that promised a winter of iron and ice. Anya sat straight-backed on the hard wooden chair, her hands folded in her lap, the worn wool of her dress a stark grey against the room's dusty brown. Beside her, her dog, Kaiser, lay with a quiet dignity, his head on his paws, his amber eyes fixed on her face. Across the desk, Mr. Sterling cleared his throat, a dry, rustling sound. He was a man who measured the world in acres and head of cattle, and he held the last will and testament of her husband, Martin, as if it were a ledger of debts. Martin's two brothers, stout men with faces hardened by sun and suspicion, stood by the window, their shadows long and grasping in the fading light. "To my brothers, I leave the south pasture, the herd, and the main cabin," Sterling read, his voice flat and devoid of sympathy. The brothers exchanged a look, a small, tight nod of grim satisfaction. All equipment, tools, and monies held in the bank are to be divided equally between them. Anya felt nothing. The grief for Martin was a deep, still ocean inside her. These small ripples of inheritance could not touch its depths. She had expected this. She was only the wife, a woman left behind. Then Sterling adjusted his spectacles, a flicker of something, pity, perhaps, or mild contempt, crossing his features. "And to my wife, Anya," he continued, pausing for effect, "to whom I leave my greatest treasure, I bequeath the deed to the North Ridge property, 40 acres known as the Barrens, and the map to find its heart." He slid a folded, yellowed piece of parchment across the polished wood of the desk. One of the brothers snorted, a sharp, ugly sound. "The Barrens?" He left her the rock pile. The Sterling offered a thin, apologetic smile. "The deed is legally filed. The land is hers." He tapped a final line on the will. "There is a final addendum." From Martin himself he cleared his throat again. For Anya, who knows the earth remembers warmth, the words hung in the cold air, nonsensical and strange. The brothers saw only a fool's sentiment. Mr. Sterling saw a worthless plot of land passed to a grieving woman. Anya saw a final letter from the man she loved. She reached out and took the map. Her fingers traced the brittle folds. It was not land he had left her. It was a riddle. A final, whispered secret just for her. She walked out of that office with her head held high, Kaiser pressing close against her leg as if to offer his own solid strength. The whispers of the town followed her, clinging like frost. The poor widow, left with nothing but a patch of useless stone and a dead man's foolish poetry. Her brothers-in-law caught up to her on the boardwalk, their faces a mixture of clumsy guilt and raw opportunism. "Anya," the elder one began, his voice rough with feigned concern. "That land, it's no place for a woman alone. We'll give you $20 for the deed. For Martin's sake, $20. An insult dressed as charity." Anya looked from his face to his brothers, seeing the same calculation in their eyes. They wanted the whole of Martin's legacy, down to the last worthless pebble. She clutched the map in her hand, the paper a fragile shield. "No," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "It was his gift to me. I will keep it." They stared at her, baffled by her refusal to accept their judgment of her inheritance. She was supposed to be grateful, broken, dependent. She was supposed to let them tidy away this last loose end of their brother's life. But something in Martin's final words, "the earth remembers warmth," had planted a seed of defiance in her. It was a choice made not with reason, but with a faith that ran deeper than logic. Faith in the man who had spent his last years staring at the northern ridge, a strange light in his eyes. She returned to the cabin she had shared with him, now a place of echoing silence. Grief threatened to pull her under, to drown her in the cold reality of her loss. But the map on the table was a buoy. It was a task. A purpose. She unrolled it carefully, its surface covered in Martin's familiar, spidery script. It was no official survey. It was a drawing from memory, marked with symbols only she might understand, a lightning-struck pine, a trio of balanced stones, a curve in the creek that looked like a sleeping wolf. For 2 days, she prepared. She packed a canvas sack with dried meat, hard biscuits, a tin of lamp oil, and a flint and steel. She sharpened the small hand-pick Martin had used for prospecting. She packed rope and a heavy blanket. The whole town watched her, a solitary woman making her mad preparations. She was choosing faith over sense, and for that, they pitied her all the more. On the third morning, with the sun a pale disk in a sky the color of lead, she locked the cabin door behind her and, with Kaiser trotting faithfully ahead, began the long walk toward the barrens. The climb to the North Ridge was a punishment. The land lived up to its name, a desolate expanse of shattered shale and wind-stunted junipers that clawed at her skirts. The air grew thinner, colder. Kaiser ranged ahead, his powerful form a dark shape against the grey rock, his presence a silent reassurance. Any other person would have seen only wasteland, a place God had forgotten to finish. But Anya looked with Martin's eyes, searching for the landmarks on his strange, intimate map. She found the lightning-scarred tree, its trunk a pale, twisted spear against the sky. She found the trio of stones, looking for all the world like a natural formation, unless you knew, as Martin must have, that their balance was too perfect. The map led her not to a peak or a valley, but to a sheer cliff face, a wall of uncompromising granite. Despair, cold and sharp as the wind, pricked at the edges of her resolve. Had it all been a madman's dream? Was this the final, cruel joke? Kaiser began to whine, pawing at a thick, tangled curtain of dead hawthorn bushes pressed against the rock. He pushed his nose into the thorns, insistent. Anya remembered the symbol on the map for this spot, not a cave mouth, but a tight spiral, like a nautilus shell. A hidden entrance. With her gloved hands, she began to pull at the brittle, thorny branches. They snapped and tore, scratching her arms, but she worked with a feverish intensity. Behind the curtain of brush, there was a crack in the rock. It was a fissure, no wider than her shoulders, a dark, uninviting split in the stone. It seemed to exhale a breath of air that was not cold. It was still. Damp. Taking a steadying breath, she squeezed through the opening, scraping her pack against the rough walls. Inside, the darkness was absolute. She fumbled for her lantern, her fingers numb and clumsy. The flint scraped, a spark caught the wick, and a soft, golden light bloomed, pushing back the immense blackness. The beam swept across a space so vast it swallowed the light. It was not a cave. It was a cathedral of stone. And then she heard it. A gentle, liquid music in the profound silence. The sound of moving water. She followed the sound, her boots making no noise on the cavern floor. The spring emerged from the base of a rock wall, not a trickle, but a steady, clear flow, pooling in a basin of stone before disappearing into the ground. She knelt and dipped her hand in. The water was not icy. It was cool, but alive, pulsing with a faint, subterranean warmth. She lifted the lantern higher. The light fell upon the cavern floor. It was not stone. It was a blanket of soil, deep and black and rich, stretching away into the darkness. In a world on the verge of freezing, Martin had left her a secret and impossible spring. She understood then. The map, the cryptic words, the worthless land, it was all a disguise. Martin hadn't left her a rock pile, he had left her a womb. A hidden place, insulated from the world's harsh judgment and harsher weather, where life could persevere. The earth remembers warmth. Here, deep in the planet's core, it had never forgotten. A wave of emotion so powerful it buckled her knees washed over her, grief for his absence, an overwhelming gratitude for his foresight. He had provided for her in a way no one, least of all his practical-minded brothers, could ever comprehend. The work began the next day. Her life found a new, singular rhythm, dictated by the journey between the cold, dying world above and the warm, living one below. Every morning, she and Kaiser would make the trek from her small cabin to the hidden fissure on the barrens. The first task was moving her worldly possessions into the cave. It was a slow, arduous process. She hauled sacks of potatoes and beans, her meager collection of tools, blankets, and oil for the lantern. The heaviest burden was the seed cache. For years, she had saved the best seeds from her small garden, a habit learned from her mother, beans with the richest color, squash that kept the longest, carrots with the straightest roots. They were her humble treasures, stored in small cloth bags and clay pots. Now, they were the promise of a future. Down in the constant, gentle warmth of the cave, she began to build her farm. She used the fallen rocks that littered the edges of the cavern to construct low-walled raised beds, her hands growing calloused and strong. The work was slow, methodical. Each stone was chosen, lifted, and placed with care. Kaiser would lie nearby, a silent, watchful guardian, his presence a comfort in the vast, quiet space. She carved narrow channels with her small pickaxe, diverting the flow from the spring to create a simple, effective irrigation system. The dark, loamy soil crumbled in her hands, smelling of life and ancient, undisturbed peace. She worked by the steady glow of a single lantern, a small bubble of light in an immense, timeless darkness. Days bled into one another. Above ground, the world was a flurry of activity, of men preparing for winter, of commerce and gossip. Down below, there was only the rhythmic scrape of her trowel, the soft gurgle of the water, and the quiet breathing of her dog. She was utterly alone, yet she had never felt less lonely. She was tending the heart of the world. She was building a secret garden at the end of everything. She was keeping a promise to a man who had trusted her to understand his final, greatest gift. The first sign of success was almost too small to see. A tiny spear of green, no bigger than an eyelash, pushing its way out of the black soil in one of the potato beds. Anya knelt, holding the lantern so close she could feel its warmth on her cheek, and stared. It was a miracle. A defiant, impossible sprout of life in a place that should have been sterile stone. Soon, it was joined by another, and then a dozen more. The bean seed sent up their sturdy, twinned leaves. The feathery tops of carrots began to emerge in neat rows. In the perpetual spring of the cavern, under the artificial sun of her lantern, her garden thrived. The air, once smelling only of damp rock and clean water, began to carry the fresh, peppery scent of growing things. Outside, the world was preparing for its long death. The vibrant golds and reds of autumn had faded to a uniform, brittle brown. The wind carried a new edge, a sharp promise of snow that made the bones ache. The townspeople of prosperity huddled deeper into their coats, their faces pinched with the familiar anxiety of the coming cold. They spoke of the hard winter predicted, of laying in extra cords of firewood and barrels of salted meat. Anya worked on, a woman living in two separate seasons at once. Her days were spent in the gentle, green warmth of her subterranean farm. She would weed the beds, thin the seedlings, and watch the steady, miraculous growth. The potatoes swelled beneath the soil, the greens grew lush and dark, and the turnips formed round, purple-shouldered globes. She harvested her first crops with a reverence that was almost painful. She scrubbed the soil from a carrot and ate it right there, the sweet, earthy crunch echoing in the great cavern. It was the taste of survival. At dusk, she and Kaiser would emerge from the fissure into the harsh, freezing air of the ridge. They would return to the cold, empty cabin, where she would light a small fire and eat a simple meal, the fresh food from her secret garden a stark contrast to the dried rations of the world above. The contrast was a constant reminder of Martin's gift. He hadn't just given her a place to grow food. He had given her a sanctuary, a refuge from the inevitable siege of winter. He had given her a world of life hidden within a world of death. And as the first snowflakes began to drift from the iron-gray sky, she knew she would need it. This winter would be different. For everyone. The snow came not as a gentle blanket, but as a furious assault. It began in the night, a howling blizzard that erased the world, burying fences and swallowing roads under monumental drifts. For a week, the wind screamed, a relentless, predatory sound that rattled the window frames and drove needles of ice through the smallest cracks. When it finally subsided, the territory was entombed in a profound and silent white. The town of Prosperity was cut off, an island in a sea of frozen stillness. The mail carrier was weeks overdue. The supply lines from the east were severed. What had been a community confident in its preparations was suddenly a prison of dwindling resources. The first to suffer were the cattle. Mr. Sterling and the other ranchers lost dozens, then hundreds, of head, the animals freezing in the fields where they stood, their bodies becoming rigid statues in the snow. The loss of the herd was a loss of wealth, but it was also a loss of the future. No cattle meant no meat, no milk, no hides. Fear, a cold and creeping thing, began to settle over the town. The shelves at Mr. Abrams' general store grew bare with alarming speed. The barrels of flour and sugar emptied. The tins of preserved fruit and vegetables vanished. Sickness followed hunger, a low-grade fever that settled in the chests of the children and the elderly, weakening them, stealing their reserves. The town became a place of locked doors and suspicious eyes. The confident bluster of men like Mr. Sterling curdled into a brittle, defensive anger. His wealth, measured in land he couldn't see and cattle he couldn't save, was useless against the suffocating power of the winter. He had spent his life accumulating things the elements could steal in a single night. He was a king with a frozen, worthless kingdom. Anya, in her hidden world, was insulated from the desperation. Her daily rhythm remained unchanged. The climb to the ridge was treacherous, a struggle against deep drifts and biting wind, but the cave was always waiting, a haven of constant, gentle warmth. Her harvests were now bountiful. Her stone-lined cellar alcove was overflowing with produce. Pyramids of potatoes and turnips, neat bundles of carrots, and stacks of collards and chard filled the cool, dry space. She had more than enough. She had an abundance. The quiet satisfaction of her labor was a constant hum beneath the surface of her thoughts. But it was a solitary abundance. A secret she held while the world above her starved. Her trips to town were rare, undertaken only when her supply of lamp oil ran critically low. On one such journey, navigating the deep, frozen ruts of the main street, she saw the reality of the town's plight. The faces she passed were gaunt, shadowed with worry. The usual sounds of a frontier town, the ring of a blacksmith's hammer, the chatter of neighbors, were gone, replaced by an unnerving, muffled quiet. In Mr. Abrams' store, the emptiness of the shelves was a physical ache. A few sacks of mealy corn and some salted fish were all that remained. Mr. Abram, a kind man who had always shown her a quiet respect, looked tired, his shoulders slumped with the weight of his community's hunger. He measured out her oil, his movement slow. "It's bad, Anya," he said, his voice barely a whisper, though they were the only two in the store. "The sickness is taking hold. Old man Hemlock passed last night. The children are weak. There's just nothing left." He didn't look at her with accusation, only with a deep, shared sorrow. His words struck her not as a plea, but as a simple statement of fact. A fact that lived in direct opposition to the reality of her own life. That night, back in the warmth of her cave, she sat amongst the bounty she had grown. The lantern light cast a warm glow on the earthy colors of her harvest. She had security. She had warmth. She had life. She had everything the people in the town had lost. She remembered their pity, the contemptuous looks from her brothers-in-law, Mr. Sterling's dismissive tone. It would be easy to hoard her miracle, to let them suffer the consequences of their own short-sightedness. A part of her, a small, hard kernel of anger, wanted to. But that was not Martin's way. His gift was not meant to be a tool for revenge. The earth remembers warmth, he had written. It was a warmth meant to be shared. The decision settled in her not as a thought, but as a certainty. It was not about proving them wrong. It was about filling a need that was absolute and undeniable. The next morning, she began to pack the heavy sled she had built from scrap lumber and runners scavenged from a broken-down cart. She filled burlap sack after burlap sack with potatoes, carrots, turnips, and hardy greens, the weight of it a satisfying burden. When the sled was piled high, a small mountain of impossible, life-giving food, she harnessed herself to its ropes. Kaiser took his place beside her, a silent, steady companion for the hard journey ahead. Together, they began the slow, grueling descent from the ridge, leaving their secret world of warmth to bring a piece of its heart to the starving world below. Her arrival in prosperity was an apparition. A lone woman and her dog, materializing from the white wilderness, hauling a sled laden with impossible riches. People stopped in the street, their faces hollowed by hunger, and stared. They saw the fresh, vibrant colors of the vegetables, the dark green of the chard, the bright orange of the carrots, and could not comprehend it. It was food from a dream, from a forgotten season. She did not pause, did not speak. She hauled the sled directly to the front of Mr. Abrams' general store and began to unload the heavy sacks, piling them on the snow-dusted boardwalk. Mr. Abram came out, his face a mask of disbelief. He reached out a trembling hand and touched a large, firm turnip as if it were a holy relic. "Anya, in God's name, where?" Before she could answer, a small crowd had gathered, drawn by the impossible sight. Among them were her brothers-in-law and Mr. Sterling, his face pale and tight with fury and confusion. He pushed his way to the front, his authority the one thing he had not yet lost. "Where did you get this?" he demanded, his voice a harsh rasp in the frozen air. "Did you have a hidden cache? Were you hoarding this while the town starved?" The accusation was ugly, a desperate attempt to reassert control. Anya looked at him, her gaze calm and unwavering. There was no triumph in her eyes, no satisfaction in his humiliation. There was only a quiet, unshakable resolve. She thought of Martin, of his faith in her, of the secret he had entrusted to her. She gave Sterling the only answer that mattered. "From the earth," she said, her voice clear and steady. It remembered the warmth, the words, the same ones from Martin's will that Sterling had read with such dismissive pity, landed with the force of a physical blow. He stared at her, his mouth slightly agape. For the first time, he seemed to see her not as a poor, foolish widow, but as a keeper of some profound mystery he could not fathom. The shame that washed over his face, and the faces of her brothers-in-law, was more potent than any shouted condemnation. In the silent space of their astonishment, her vindication was complete. It was quiet. It was earned. And it was absolute. The food was a communion. Mr. Abram, his eyes bright with tears, organized the distribution immediately. He weighed out portions with a jeweler's care, ensuring every family received a share. That night, for the first time in weeks, the smell of roasting vegetables and hearty soup drifted from the chimneys of prosperity. It was more than just sustenance for the body, it was a balm for the town's broken spirit. The vegetables broke the fever of desperation, replacing it with a fragile, burgeoning hope. Anya became a figure of quiet legend. She had not explained her miracle, and no one dared to ask. They simply accepted the gift. The mystery of its origin only added to their reverence. She was the woman who had walked out of the frozen wasteland with the heart of a summer garden. She was no longer the poor widow, she was Anya. Her brothers-in-law came to her cabin a few days later, their hats clutched in their thick, calloused hands. They stood on her doorstep, shifting their weight, unable to meet her gaze. "We were wrong, Anya," the elder one mumbled, the words costing him a visible effort. "About the land. About Martin. We are sorry." Their apology was a clumsy, broken thing, but she knew it was sincere. It was the only one they knew how to give. She simply nodded, accepting it without comment. Their opinions no longer held any power over her. Their judgment was a currency that had lost all its value. The work was what mattered. The earth was what mattered. She continued her trips, hauling the sled down twice a week, each time leaving a fresh supply of life on the steps of the general store. The townspeople began to leave things for her in return, a few precious rounds of ammunition for a hunting rifle she didn't own, a freshly sharpened axe head, a small pouch of salt, a neatly mended blanket. They were offerings, tokens of a deep and wordless gratitude. Mr. Abram became her stanchest ally, a silent partner in her mission. He set aside lamp oil and other necessities for her without question, a fair trade for the miracle she provided. She remained apart from them, a resident of a different world, but she was no longer an outcast. She was the quiet, steady anchor that was holding their world together. The winter did not surrender easily. It clung to the land for 2 more months, a stubborn tyrant refusing to release its grip. But its power over the town was broken. Anya's steady supply of food kept the worst of the hunger and sickness at bay. The people of prosperity, sustained by the warmth from her hidden earth, endured. When the thaw finally came, it arrived with a sudden, dramatic rush. The snow melted, the creek swelled, and the first green shoots of wild grass pushed through the sodden ground. The world above ground was waking up, remembering its own promise of life. The town had been irrevocably changed. The ordeal had stripped away their easy assumptions about wealth and power. They had learned that a man's worth was not measured by the size of his herd or the breadth of his land, but by his ability to endure, to provide, to share. The harshest winter in memory had taught them the truest meaning of prosperity. Anya continued her work. The cave was her life now, its rhythms her own. The return of spring to the world above did not diminish the magic of the world below. It was her sanctuary, her purpose, her silent partner. The townspeople, when they spoke of the North Ridge, no longer called it the Barrens. They called it Anya's Ridge, or sometimes, in quieter, more reflective moments, Martin's gift. Her legacy was not written in a deed or a bank ledger. It was written in the lives she had saved. It was etched in the community's newfound respect for the quiet, overlooked corners of the world, for the wisdom that valued a living spring over a gold coin. The story closes not with an ending, but with a continuation. Anya is in the cave, the soft glow of the lantern illuminating the lush green of her garden. Her hands, strong and gentle, are deep in the rich, black soil, tending to a new row of seedlings. Kaiser sleeps at her feet, his tail twitching in a dream. The only sound is the constant, gentle music of the spring, a ceaseless promise in the warm, living dark. The earth had remembered its warmth, and because one woman had listened with her heart instead of her ears, it had provided for them all. That is how a quiet inheritance, dismissed as worthless, can become the salvation of a world.